A self-taught engineer creates a metal stronger than steel from junkyard scraps. But just as he's about to change the industry forever, a powerful billionaire sets out to destroy everything he built. Will he rise, or be crushed before the world ever knows his name? The scent of rust and oil filled the air as Rick Callahan wiped the sweat from his forehead. The blazing sun reflected off the piles of scrap metal surrounding him, making the junkyard feel like an oven. He had spent his entire life among discarded engines, twisted iron and broken machinery, but to him, this place was more than just a dump. It was a treasure trove of forgotten potential. His father, Joe Callahan, a burly man with grease-stained hands and a cigarette always dangling from his lips, was stacking old car parts onto a wooden pallet. "You keep staring at that pile like it's gold, boy," he muttered without looking up. "But no one pays for dreams. They pay for scrap." Rick didn't respond. He had heard those words too many times before. While his father saw useless metal, Rick saw something different. He saw possibilities, innovations. Mike Carter, his best friend since childhood, leaned against a rusted truck, sipping a cheap soda. "You still thinking about that metal composite idea of yours?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. Rick nodded. "If I can refine it, it could be stronger than steel and way cheaper to produce. We'd be recycling, lowering costs, and revolutionizing manufacturing." His voice was full of conviction, but even as he spoke, he knew how ridiculous it must have sounded. Mike smirked. "And let me guess, Ethan Mercer turned you down again." Rick clenched his jaw at the mention of the name. Ethan Mercer was the CEO of Mercer Industries, the largest manufacturer in town. The man was rich, powerful, and had no interest in listening to someone who spent his days digging through scrap. "Yeah," Rick admitted. "Didn't even look at my prototype. Just laughed and called me a junkyard boy in front of his investors." Mike let out a low whistle. That's rough." Joe grunted from the other side of the yard. "What did I tell you? These big-shot businessmen don't care about ideas from people like us." He threw a rusted muffler onto the ground. "You're wasting time, Rick. Learn the trade. Scrap pays the bills, not dreams." Rick refused to accept that. He knew he had something valuable, something that could change the game. But convincing someone to take a chance on a junkyard worker was proving impossible. A sleek black car pulled up near the entrance, its polished exterior out of place against the rust and dirt. Rick recognized it instantly. It belonged to Ethan Mercer. His heart pounded. Why was he here? Ethan stepped out, wearing a tailored suit and an expression of mild amusement. "Callahan," he said smoothly, taking off his sunglasses. "I figured I'd come see the junkyard genius for myself." Rick's fists tightened. He had no doubt Mercer wasn't here to invest, but rather to mock him further. "Still playing with scraps?" Ethan continued, his voice dripping with condescension. Rick forced himself to remain calm. "If by playing, you mean working on something that could change the industry, then yeah." Ethan chuckled. "You really think anyone will take you seriously? A guy like you with no funding, no name, no connections?" Rick held his ground. "I don't need a name. I need a chance." Ethan smirked. "Then let me give you some advice. Quit before you embarrass yourself even more." The words stung, but Rick didn't look away. He had no intention of quitting. If no one would give him a chance, he'd create one himself. Rick watched as Ethan Mercer climbed back into his luxury car and drove off, leaving a trail of dust behind. The weight of the insult settled deep in his chest. He had been humiliated before, but this time something felt different. The fire inside him burned hotter. Mike clapped him on the back. "You know he's just a rich prick trying to get inside your head, right?" Rick exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. "Yeah, but he's right about one thing. I don't have a name or connections. If I want this to work, I have to make people take me seriously." His father scoffed from across the yard. "And how exactly are you gonna do that?" Joe leaned against a pile of old tires, shaking his head. "You got a fancy lab hidden somewhere. Investors lining up at the door." Rick ignored the sarcasm. I don't need a lab. I need results. He turned and strode toward his small workspace at the back of the junkyard, a shed filled with old tools, salvaged parts, and the heart of his idea, a pile of metal composites he'd been experimenting with for months. The pieces weren't perfect, but he was getting closer. Mike followed him inside, eyeing the cluttered space. So, what's the plan? We need money to develop this, and last time I checked, you're not exactly rolling in cash. Rick picked up a small metallic plate, running his fingers over its surface. It was a blend of recycled aluminum, steel, and a binding compound he'd been testing. If he could refine the process, it would be lighter and stronger than traditional metals. Mike hesitated. And if there isn't? Rick's grip tightened on the metal. Then I'll do it myself. No more waiting for permission. No more begging guys like Mercer to listen. Joe laughed dryly from outside. You sound just like your mother used to. Rick glanced at his father. His mother had been a dreamer too, full of ideas and ambition. But when she passed away, reality hit hard. His father had buried himself in work, convinced that dreams only led to disappointment. I'll prove it's not just a dream, Rick said. I'll find a way, Rick muttered. There's gotta be someone out there willing to take a risk on innovation. The next morning he got to work. Every spare minute was spent refining his formula. He tested durability, tensile strength, heat resistance, everything he could think of. He failed more times than he could count, but each mistake got him closer. Mike stuck around, helping where he could. We need to pitch this to someone with actual money, he said one evening, wiping sweat from his forehead. Rick frowned. The bank already turned me down. Mike grinned. So we go elsewhere. I know someone who might be able to help. Claire Bennett. She's a corporate lawyer, but more importantly, she believes in underdogs. If we can convince her this is worth something, maybe she can connect us to real investors. Rick hesitated. He hated asking for help. But then he thought of Ethan Mercer's smirk, of the way people looked down on him. All right, he said. Let's set up a meeting. Little did he know that meeting would change everything. Rick adjusted his shirt collar as he stood outside the sleek glass building in downtown Denver. The reflection of the towering skyscrapers loomed over him, a stark contrast to the rust and grit of the junkyard he called home. He had never set foot in a place like this before. The air smelled of coffee and expensive cologne, and businessmen in tailored suits walked past him without a second glance. Mike nudged him. You good? Rick exhaled. Just not used to places like this. Relax. Claire's cool, Mike assured him. She wouldn't have agreed to meet if she thought we were wasting her time. They stepped inside, the lobby buzzing with a low hum of conversations and the rhythmic clicking of heels against the polished marble floor. A receptionist directed them to a conference room, where Claire Bennett was already waiting. She was younger than Rick had expected, mid-30s, sharp-eyed with a no-nonsense presence. She wore a fitted blazer and had her blonde hair tied back in a neat ponytail. Her expression was unreadable as she gestured for them to sit. Mike says you have something worth looking at, Claire said, getting straight to the point. Rick pulled out a small sheet of metal from his bag and placed it on the table. This is a composite I've been developing. It's lighter than steel, just as strong, and made entirely from recycled materials. If I can refine it, it could change the way industries approach manufacturing. Claire studied the metal, running her fingers over its surface. And you developed this in a junkyard. Rick stiffened, but there was no mockery in her tone, just curiosity. Yes, he said. With the right funding, I can scale up production, improve the formula, and bring it to market. She leaned back in her chair. Do you have a patent? Rick hesitated. Not yet. Claire sighed. That's your first problem. Without a patent, anyone with money and influence can take this idea from you. You need legal protection before you pitch this to serious investors. Rick exchanged a glance with Mike. How much would that cost? More than you have, Claire said bluntly. Filing fees, legal consultations, prototypes. You're looking at least 15 grand, probably more. Rick's stomach sank. 15 grand was an impossible number. Then maybe we find an investor first, Mike suggested. Someone who'll fund the patent and production. Claire shook her head. No serious investor will put money into something that isn't legally protected. If I introduce you to anyone and you don't have a patent, you're just handing them your invention on a silver platter. Rick clenched his fists. Another roadblock. Another person telling him why he couldn't do it. Claire must have noticed his frustration because she softened slightly. Look, I think you have something real here. But you need to be smart. If you can get the money for the patent, come back to me. Then we'll talk about investors. Rick nodded, even though the weight of the problem pressed heavy on his chest. As they left the office, Mike muttered, "So, where the hell are we supposed to get 15 grand? Rick didn't have an answer. But he wasn't about to give up. Rick sat on the edge of his cot in the tiny back room of the junkyard office, staring at the crumpled note where he had scribbled the number. $15,000. It might as well have been $1 million. Mike paced the room. We need a plan, man. We can't just sit here and hope money falls from the sky. Rick rubbed his hands over his face. No. I just don't know how the hell we're supposed to get that much cash. His father, Joe, leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. Hate to say I told you so, but this is why you don't chase pipe dreams, he said. You want 15 grand. Start working double shifts. Stop wasting time. Rick's jaw tightened. I'm not giving up. Mike snapped his fingers. What about crowdfunding? People throw money at dumb ideas all the time. Yours actually makes sense. Rick shook his head. Takes too long, and we don't have a prototype flashy enough to impress strangers online. Mike sighed. Then we need someone with money. Someone who believes in this as much as we do. That's when Rick remembered Claire's words. No investor would back them without a patent. But what if they could change the way they approached an investor? Plans started forming. Mercer is hosting an industry event tomorrow night, Rick said. Every major investor in the state will be there. Mike frowned. Yeah, and they're not just gonna let a couple of guys from a junkyard stroll in. Which is why we're not gonna ask for permission. Mike stared at him. You want to crash a billionaire's party? Rick smirked. Whoa. I want to show them something they can't ignore. The next night, Mercer Industries' annual gala. The event was everything Rick expected. Extravagant, exclusive, and filled with people who never had to worry about a $15,000 problem. Mike adjusted his cheap blazer. We stick out like sore thumbs, he muttered. Good, Rick replied, scanning the room. Let's find Claire. They spotted her near the bar, deep in conversation with a man in a dark suit. Rick hesitated. He had no real plan beyond getting inside. And now, standing among these powerful people, he felt the weight of his risk. But then, across the ballroom, he saw Ethan Mercer. The smug billionaire was laughing with a group of investors, sipping champagne like he owned the world. Rick squared his shoulders. I'm not walking out of here without making them see what I can do. He grabbed a metal sheet from his bag and headed toward the stage. Mike cursed. Oh, this is gonna be bad. Rick climbed onto the platform, ignoring the murmurs from the crowd. He slammed the metal onto the podium, making everyone turn. This, Rick said, his voice steady despite the stares, is the future of manufacturing. Ethan turned, his amused expression quickly darkening. What the hell is this guy doing here? Claire's eyes widened in shock. Rick didn't care. He had the floor. He had their attention. Now he just had to make them believe. A heavy silence filled the ballroom. Dozens of investors, executives, and industry leaders stared at Rick as if he had just lost his mind. He knew he had only a few seconds before security dragged him out, so he had to make them count. This metal, Rick said, lifting the sheet and knocking it against the podium, producing a sharp clang, is stronger than steel, half the weight, and made from 100% recycled materials. It's the most cost-efficient innovation this industry has seen in years. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Some people looked intrigued. Others, like Ethan Mercer, looked furious. Ethan took a step forward. His voice smooth but laced with venom. Richard Callahan, isn't it? The junkyard kid who thinks he's an engineer. A few chuckles rippled through the crowd. Rick met his gaze without flinching. I don't think I'm an engineer, Mercer. I'm one. And I've built something that's going to change your industry. A deep voice cut through the tension. And what exactly makes this better than what's already on the market? Rick turned toward the man who had spoken, Samuel Reed, an older investor known for backing high-risk innovations. If there was anyone here who might listen, it was him. Traditional metals are expensive, heavy, and wasteful, Rick explained quickly. This composite is stronger, lighter, and can be produced at a fraction of the cost. It reduces material waste by over 60% and maintains durability under extreme conditions. Samuel Reed took a slow sip of his drink, studying Rick. Sounds impressive, but anyone can make claims. Do you have real data? Rick hesitated. This was his moment. If he lied, it would come back to bite him. If he told the truth. No, he admitted. Not yet. But I have working samples, and if you give me 2 weeks, I can get you the data you need. Ethan laughed, stepping in front of Rick. This is ridiculous. Callahan is a nobody, making big promises with no proof. You're wasting everyone's time. Rick's heart pounded, but before he could respond, another voice spoke up. I'll give you the 2 weeks. It was Claire. She stepped forward, folding her arms. If Callahan delivers, you'll have a material that can disrupt an entire industry. If he doesn't, you lose nothing. Seems like a fair deal. Samuel Reed smirked. I like risk takers. All right, Callahan. You have 2 weeks to prove me wrong. Rick's pulse surged. This was it. His chance. Ethan clenched his jaw. You're making a mistake. Samuel shrugged. I've made worse. Rick extended his hand. You won't regret this. Samuel shook it. Let's hope not. As security finally escorted Rick and Mike out, Mike laughed under his breath. That was either the dumbest or the smartest thing you've ever done. Rick exhaled, feeling the weight of what he had just committed to. Guess we'll find out in 2 weeks. The cold wind bit at Rick's face as he and Mike stepped out onto the sidewalk. The weight of the deal with Samuel Reed pressed down on his chest. 2 weeks. That was all he had to prove that his metal composite wasn't just a junkyard fantasy. Mike shoved his hands into his pockets. So, just checking, do we actually have a working prototype? Rick let out a breath. Not yet. But we're close. Mike groaned. Man, you really know how to live on the edge. They returned to the junkyard that night, and Rick immediately got to work. He experimented with heat treatment, pressure resistance, and flexibility, determined to fine-tune the formula. Failure after failure didn't shake him. He was too far in now. By the third night, his hands were covered in burns and cuts, his muscles aching from lack of sleep. But then something clicked. The latest batch of metal held up against every test. Stronger, lighter, durable. Mike stared at the results. Holy shit, we actually did it. Rick grinned. Now we just need to run official lab tests. If the data confirms what we already know, we're in business. Mike frowned. And how exactly do we afford lab testing? Rick's excitement dimmed. They still had no funding. Before he could answer, his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. Callahan. The voice was smooth, familiar. Rick's stomach turned. Ethan Mercer. You've been busy, Ethan said. Word is, Samuel Reed is taking a gamble on you. Guess he's more desperate for a win than I thought. Rick gritted his teeth. What do you want, Mercer? Ethan chuckled. Just a friendly warning. You're playing in a league you don't belong to. And you're about to get crushed. Rick's grip on the phone tightened. You afraid of a little competition? Competition? Ethan laughed. You're a kid from a junkyard, Callahan. I've been running this industry since before you could drive. I don't need to beat you. I just need to watch you fail. Rick exhaled through his nose. Well, you're gonna be waiting a long time. There was a pause. Then Ethan said, tell you what. I'll save you the humiliation. Come work for me. I'll buy your little idea, pay you a generous salary, And you can stop embarrassing yourself. Rick almost laughed. So now you want to buy me out? Ethan's voice sharpened. I want to keep you from making a mistake you can't take back. Rick clenched his jaw. Not interested. Ethan sighed. Fine. Then don't say I didn't warn you. The call disconnected. Mike frowned. That sounded ominous. Rick set his phone down. Mercer's scared. Mike snorted. Or setting you up. Rick didn't want to admit it, but the thought had already crossed his mind. Because guys like Ethan Mercer didn't make offers out of kindness. They made them when they saw a threat. And if Ethan saw him as a threat, that meant he was finally doing something right. The next morning, Rick wasted no time. He and Mike loaded the perfected metal samples into the truck and drove straight to Denver Materials Lab, one of the few places that could run official industrial-grade tests. If the results confirmed what they had seen in the junkyard, they would have undeniable proof that their composite was revolutionary. As they walked into the sleek white facility, a lab tech approached them. You Callahan? Rick nodded. You're lucky, the man said. Someone already covered the cost of your tests. Anonymous donation. Rick and Mike exchanged a look. This had Mercer's fingerprints all over it. Think it's a trap, Mike muttered. Rick clenched his jaw. Only one way to find out. They handed over the samples and the tests began. Over the next few days, the metal was subjected to extreme heat, pressure, and impact resistance. Then came the results. Rick's heart pounded as the head researcher handed him the report. Your material, the man said, exceeded our expectations. It's more durable than steel, has a lower production cost, and performs exceptionally well under stress. This is a game changer. Rick exhaled. He had done it. Mike grinned. Damn right it is. Rick immediately called Claire. We have proof. We're ready. 2 days later, they sat in a conference room at Reed Industries, Samuel Reed's headquarters. The older investor leaned back in his chair, flipping through the test results with an unreadable expression. You sure about these numbers? He asked. Claire nodded. I had them verified by a third party. It's legit. Reed exhaled. Well, Callahan, I have to admit I'm impressed. But innovation isn't enough. You need funding, production capacity, and distribution. He paused. I can provide all three. Rick sat up straighter. You're interested? Reed smirked. More than interested. I'm offering $1 million investment in exchange for 40% equity in your company. Mike nearly choked. Rick's mind raced. $1 million would change everything. But 40% was a big cut. Claire's voice was calm. That's a strong offer, but a bit aggressive for someone who just saw the data. Reed chuckled. Business is about risk and reward, Ms. Bennett. Callahan has the idea. I have the resources. Without me, this stays a junkyard project. Rick hesitated. This was his invention, his life's work. Giving up nearly half of it made him uneasy. Before he could respond, the door swung open. Ethan Mercer strode in like he owned the place. Apologies for the interruption, he said smoothly, but I'd like to make a counteroffer. Rick's stomach twisted. Reed folded his arms. You've got a lot of nerve barging in here, Mercer. Ethan ignored him, his eyes locked on Rick. I'll give you $2 million. Front. No waiting, no conditions except one. Rick already knew what was coming. You walk away. Shut down your project. Permanently. Silence filled the room. Mike whispered. Tell me you're not even thinking about it. Rick wasn't. He met Ethan's gaze and without hesitation said, Go to hell. Ethan's smirk faltered for half a second before he regained composure. You'll regret that, Callahan. Rick turned back to Reed. Let's negotiate. Reed grinned. Now that's what I like to hear. Rick stepped out of Reed Industries with a signed contract in hand. The deal had been negotiated down to 25% equity for Reed's investment, enough funding to set up production while keeping control of his own company. It was a win. Mike walked beside him, shaking his head. Man, I still can't believe you turned down $2 million cash just like that. Rick let out a short laugh. It wasn't real money. It was a bribe to kill this before it even started. Mike grinned. And now Mercer's pissed. That much was obvious. Ethan Mercer had never been told no before. And Rick had done it in front of one of the most powerful investors in the industry. That night, Rick barely got 2 hours of sleep. His mind raced with plans. Hiring workers, securing equipment, finding a manufacturing site. For the first time, his future wasn't just a dream. It was happening. The next morning, however, everything fell apart. Rick arrived at the junkyard to find Joe waiting for him. Arms crossed, jaw tight. "We got a problem." Rick frowned. "What kind of problem?" Joe gestured toward the entrance. Rick's stomach dropped. A notice was taped to the rusted gate. "Cease and desist order. City of Denver. Due to environmental violations, all operations must be suspended indefinitely." Rick ripped the paper off and read the fine print. It cited safety hazards, zoning infractions, and unauthorized waste disposal. Mike cursed under his breath. "This is Mercer." Rick clenched his jaw. Course it was. Ethan couldn't beat him fairly, so he was playing dirty. Joe rubbed his forehead. "City officials were here an hour ago. Said they got an anonymous complaint about hazardous materials on the property. They'll shut us down permanently if we don't resolve the issues." Rick's hands curled into fists. "How do we fix this?" Joe exhaled. "We don't. These things take months, sometimes years, to fight in court. You think they're actually gonna let us fix it? The whole thing's a setup." Rick felt the rage simmer in his chest. Mercer wasn't just trying to stop his company. He was trying to wipe out everything Rick had. Mike ran a hand through his hair. "All right, so what do we do? We can't lose momentum now." Rick thought fast. "We need a temporary workspace. Somewhere to start production until we can fight this." Mike's eyes lit up. "Reed owns multiple industrial sites, right?" Rick nodded. "I'll talk to him today. We'll set up shop under his company's protection, away from Mercer's influence." Joe narrowed his eyes. "You sure this is worth all the trouble, kid?" Rick stared at the cease and desist order in his hands. The junkyard had been his entire life. Mercer wanted to bury him under legal red tape and corporate power. Rick wasn't going to let that happen. He looked his father in the eye. "Yeah, it is." Because now, it wasn't just about proving himself. It was about making sure Mercer knew he had picked the wrong man to crush. Rick wasted no time. By noon, he was back at Reed Industries, sitting across from Samuel Reed in his glass-walled office. The city skyline stretched out behind the investor, but Rick had no time to admire the view. "You need a production site?" Reed asked, flipping through some documents. "I assume this has something to do with Mercer." Rick nodded. "He got my junkyard shut down. Bogus environmental violations. I can fight it, but I need a place to start production now." Reed leaned back in his chair, studying Rick for a long moment. Then he smirked. "You're not the first person Mercer's tried to crush. Won't be the last either." "Then you know what we're up against," Rick said. Reed nodded. "Lucky for you, I don't like bullies." He pulled out a folder and slid it across the desk. "I've got a warehouse in Commerce City. It's not state-of-the-art, but it's fully operational. I'll lease it to you under my name. Keep Mercer from interfering." Rick scanned the paperwork. The terms were fair. No hidden traps. Just a real chance to keep his company moving forward. "Consider this a test," Reed added. "I put my money on underdogs, Callahan. Don't make me regret it." Rick met his gaze. "You won't." The first test run. 2 days later, the new workspace was up and running. The air smelled of hot metal and industrial grease as workers installed equipment. Rick's company was no longer just an idea, it was real. Mike walked up beside him, arms crossed. "Man, I don't know whether to be excited or scared." Rick chuckled. "Both is probably the right call." Claire arrived not long after, carrying a folder of legal documents. "The cease and desist order is getting messy," she said. "Mercer has ties in city zoning offices." He's going to drag this out as long as he can. Rick clenched his jaw. We just need to push forward. If we can deliver the first batch of metal to Reed in time, he'll have leverage to keep Mercer off our backs. Claire sighed. Then you better pray nothing else goes wrong. And then it did. That night Rick's phone buzzed. Unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. Callahan. A rough voice spoke on the other end. Might want to check your warehouse, kid. The line went dead. Rick's stomach dropped. He grabbed his keys, called Mike, and within minutes they were speeding toward the warehouse. When they arrived, Rick's worst fear became reality. The loading dock doors were wide open. Sparks flickered in the darkness, illuminating the twisted wreckage of what had once been his production line. Metal sheets were scattered across the floor, burned, broken, ruined. Mike let out a low whistle. Mercer. Rick's hands shook as he stepped forward, staring at the damage. This wasn't just sabotage. It was a warning. For the first time, doubt crept in. Mercer wasn't playing fair. He was willing to burn everything down to stop Rick. Mike placed a hand on his shoulder. What now? Rick clenched his fists. If Mercer thought this was over, he was dead wrong. Because now it was personal. Rick stood in the wreckage of his warehouse, the air thick with the scent of burnt metal and melted plastic. The machines were destroyed. The first batch of his revolutionary composite gone. Months of work had been turned to ashes in a single night. Mike kicked a twisted piece of steel. I swear to God, I'm gonna put Mercer's face through a wall. Claire arrived moments later, eyes wide as she took in the destruction. Is this? Rick cut her off. We're not done. Mike turned to him. Dude, what part of our factory just got torched, aren't you getting? Rick refused to let this be the end. He'd fought too hard. We still have the formula, the process, the research. Mercer didn't destroy the idea, just the machines. We can rebuild. Claire crossed her arms. Rick, I admire your optimism, but we don't have time for that. Reed expects delivery tomorrow. That was the part that stung the most. If they couldn't produce on time, they'd lose everything. The deal, the funding, their credibility. But then, an idea hit Rick like a freight train. He turned to Mike. How much raw material do we have left? Mike frowned. Not much. A few sheets of composite, maybe enough for one last batch. But without the machines, we can't. Rick grinned. Then we do it by hand. One last shot. Rick, Mike, Claire, and every worker willing to fight back spent the next 24 hours straight forging the metal by hand. They worked through the night, shaping, pressing, and tempering each piece with whatever equipment survived the fire. By morning they had just enough. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't polished. But it was real. Rick and Mike loaded the materials into a truck, speeding toward Reed's office. When they arrived, Samuel Reed was already waiting. He lifted one of the metal sheets, examining it closely. Rick held his breath. Reed looked up. Callahan. This is damn impressive. Relief flooded Rick's body. Your team did this in one night. Reed asked. Rick wiped sweat from his forehead. We don't quit. Reed smirked. Good. Because Mercer's going to lose his mind when he sees what happens next. Mercer's defeat. That afternoon, Reed announced his investment publicly. The industry press covered it. Investors took notice. And just like that, Mercer lost control of the game. When Rick saw Mercer again, this time at a high-profile industry event, Ethan's face was tight with barely contained fury. You should have taken my money, Callahan, Mercer said in a low voice. Rick smiled. And you should have backed the right guy when you had the chance. Mercer clenched his jaw. This isn't over. Rick shrugged. For me it is. Because for the first time in his life he had won. The future begins. Months later, Callahan Composites was fully operational. The new factory, funded by Reed, protected from Mercer, was producing materials that would revolutionize the industry. Rick stood outside the facility, watching his workers load shipments onto trucks. Mike clapped him on the back. So, Billionaire in 5 years. Rick smirked. Give me 3. Claire laughed. I'll make sure your contracts are ready for that. Joe, his father, approached from behind. He didn't say much, just nodded at his son, eyes filled with something like pride. Rick took a deep breath. The kid from the junkyard had done it. And he wasn't stopping now. Rick Callahan fought against impossible odds, turning scrap metal into a revolutionary material. But what truly defines success? Is it money, power, or the ability to rise after every fall? After facing sabotage, betrayal, and the weight of an industry against him, Rick proved that resilience is the key to real victory. But ask yourself, if you were in his shoes, would you have had the strength to keep going? Or would you have given in to the easy way out? Click on the video on the screen now to continue this journey of self-discovery and ambition. If Rick's story inspired you, make sure to subscribe so you never miss another lesson in perseverance, success, and the power of never backing down. I'll see you in the next one.